A person who understands dependent origination correctly will escape the misunderstandings stemming from these scenarios and beliefs mentioned above. For example, the belief in a first cause or a belief in the supernatural. The Buddha addresses this topic in the following passages. When Bhikkhus, a noble disciple, has clearly seen with correct wisdom, as it really is, this dependent origination and these dependently arisen phenomena, it is impossible that he will run back into the past, thinking, "Did I exist in the past? Did I not exist in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? Having been what did I become in the past?" Or that he will run forward into the future, thinking, Will I exist in the future? Will I not exist in the future? What will I be in the future? How will I be in the future? Having been what will I become in the future? Or that he will now be inwardly confused about the present thus, "Do I exist? Do I not exist? What am I? How am I? This being, where has it come from, and where will it go?" For what reason is this impossible? Because the noble disciple has clearly seen with correct wisdom, as it really is, this dependent origination and these dependently arisen phenomena. A person who understands dependent origination is not confused by the metaphysical dilemmas known as the Unanswerable Questions, Abhaya Panha. When people asked these questions, the Buddha would remain silent. He said that he would not explain them because when a person sees the interdependent nature of things, these questions are considered trivial and worthless. These dilemmas are also known as the 10 erroneous extremist views, Atta Gahika Ditti, as illustrated below. What Master Gautama is the cause and reason why, when wanderers of other sects are asked such questions? 1. Is the world eternal? 2. Is the world not eternal? 3. Is the world finite? 4. Is the world infinite? 5. Are the life principle and the body the same? 6. Is the life principle one thing and the body another? 7. Does a being exist after death? 8. Does a being not exist after death? 9. Does a being both exist and not exist after death? 10. Does a being neither exist nor not exist after death? They give such answers as, "The world is eternal, the world is not eternal, a being neither exists nor does not exist after death." And what is the cause and reason why, when Master Gautama is asked such questions, he does not give such answers? Vacha, wanderers of other sects regard form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. They regard feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in self, or self as in consciousness. Therefore, when the wanderers of other sects are asked such questions, they give such answers as, "The world is eternal, but the Tathagata, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one, does not regard form as self, or self as in consciousness. Therefore, when the Tathagata is asked such questions, he does not give such answers." There are other erroneous doctrines and theories concerning karma that conflict with the teaching of dependent origination, but these will be discussed in the separate chapter on karma. 8. Dependent origination in a social context. So far the discussion has focused only on dependent origination as it occurs in the minds and lives of individual people. In the Maha-Nidana Sutta, however, which is a very important teaching and is the longest of all suttas describing dependent origination, the Buddha explained conditionality both in a person's mind and between people or in society. Following is a brief explanation of how dependent origination works on a social level. The origination of suffering, or the origination of evil in society, proceeds in the same fashion as the origination of suffering in an individual, but the manifestation of social ills begins with craving. In the following passage, the Buddha highlights this link in the chain of dependent origination. And so, Ananda, feeling conditions craving, craving conditions seeking, pariyesana, seeking conditions acquisition, labha, acquisition conditions appraisal, vinichaya, appraisal conditions passionate attachment, chanda raga, passionate attachment conditions preoccupation, ajosana, preoccupation conditions possessiveness, parigaha, possessiveness conditions stinginess, machariya, stinginess conditions protectiveness, araka, and dependent on protectiveness. As a consequence of protectiveness, there arise the taking up of stick and sword, quarrels, disputes, arguments, strife, abuse, lying, and other evil, unskillful states. The Maha-Nidana Sutta thus introduces an alternative sequence of dependent origination, containing factors different from those manifesting in an individual. The factors shared by both formats are illustrated thus: ignorance to volitional formations, to consciousness, to mind and body, to six sense bases, to contact, to feeling, and to craving. Within an individual, when craving tanha arises, the process continues as follows: craving to grasping, to becoming, to birth, to aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, etc. equals individual suffering. In society, however, craving leads to these alternative factors: craving to seeking, to acquisition, to appraisal, to passionate attachment, to preoccupation, to possessiveness, to stinginess, to protectiveness, to quarrels, disputes, arguments, strife, etc. equals social problems. The Kalawawidada Sutta contains similar material, but it is in the form of questions and answers, and is composed in verse, so differs in some of the details. To help explain dependent origination as it relates to social conditions, one can examine associated processes that are mentioned elsewhere in the scriptures. For example, the process of differentiation, nata, the existence of various elements, dhatu, nata, to the various forms of contact, pasa, nantana, to the various kinds of feeling, vedana, nantana, to various perceptions, sanya, nantana, to various thoughts, sankappa, nantana, to various desires, chanda, nantana, to various passions, parilaha, nantana, to various forms of seeking, pariyesana, nantana, to various forms of acquisition, labha nantana. The first section of the above passage, from the elements to perception, can be summarized as the various elements generate various perceptions. Another passage in the canon therefore presents this outlined as followed. Various elements to various perceptions, to various thoughts, to various desires, to various passions, to various forms of seeking, to various forms of acquisition. These alternative presentations of dependent origination combine internal human dynamics with external social affairs. They present a wide perspective, revealing the source of social problems to be people's mental defilements. It may be said that those suttas explaining the wider implications of mental defilement, for example, the Agana Sutta, the Chakravarti Sutta, and the Vaseta Sutta, are working models of dependent origination in a social context. There are a couple of important points to keep in mind when examining this form of presentation. The law of conditionality implies a dependency and necessity between factors. In the phrase feeling conditions craving, the arising of craving depends on feeling. Feeling is required for craving to arise. However, when feeling exists, it does not necessarily lead to craving. It is at this link between feeling and craving that the cycle of dependent origination can be severed, as corroborated by the sutta passages mentioned earlier, which describe the arising of feeling without subsequent craving. When a person experiences feeling with adequate mindfulness and clear comprehension, the link is cut and craving does not arise. Note from the Mahanidana Sutta that the Buddha began his analysis of social woes at this juncture, where feeling conditions craving, Vedanam paticca tanha. This link between feeling and craving is a crucial stage and has a direct bearing on human behavior and social well-being. The suttas cited above describe how aspects of human society, like the caste system and differences in individual circumstances, result from human interactions and are influenced by the natural environment. Social conditions are shaped by the interdependency between human beings, beginning with people's mental qualities, society, and the natural environment. For example, a person's feelings rely on contact, which is affected by social and environmental factors, as well as internal factors like perception. When craving follows feeling, subsequent behavior may have an impact on other people and on the environment, so that all factors are affected. Human beings are not the only factor influencing society and the environment. Neither are society or the environment the only factor in influencing the other two. The three are interdependent. Sections of the Agana Sutta illustrate the process of conditionality. Idle individuals hoard grain, and this practice becomes popular. 2 areas are established for allocating grain. 2 greedy individuals steal grain from others to increase their share. 2 there arises censure, deceit, punishment, and fighting. 2 wise individuals see the need for government. There develops the practice of electing a leader or king, Katiya. Some people become disillusioned with the corruption in society and go to live in the forest to free themselves from evil and develop jhana. Some of these people live near populated areas, they study and compose texts, and the terms Brahman, Brahmana is coined. Those people who have families and pursue various forms of enterprise are called merchants, Oesa. Others whose behaviour is considered vulgar or inferior are branded as low class, Suddha. To members of each of these four groups abandon their personal customs, renounce the household life, and go forth as ascetics, samana. This sutta shows that various castes and social classes are formed and conditioned by naturally occurring human relationships. They are not created by a creator God. Every person has the choice to perform good or bad deeds, and everyone will equally receive the fruits of their actions in accord with natural laws. And every person who cultivates the Dhamma correctly can reach liberation, can reach Nibbana. The Chakravarti Sutta mentioned above describes the conditions underlying crime and other social ills. Government leaders do not provide financial assistance to the poor, to poverty is rampant, to theft is rampant, to the use of weapons is rampant, to killing is rampant, to the spread of lying, divisive speech, harsh and frivolous speech, sexual misconduct, covetousness, hostility, wrong views, attachment to unrighteousness, Udama raga, greed, injustice, Miccha dhamma, lack of respect for parents, ascetics and Brahmins, lack of respect according to social standing, to the decline of beauty and longevity. 9. The link between the middle teaching and the middle way. The middle teaching, Ma Jena Dhamma Desana, is the objective truth revealed by the Buddha. The truth that all beings naturally accord with causes and conditions, and that they are not subject to the extreme or biased views fabricated by people to match their erroneous perceptions and their desires for the world to be a certain way. The middle teaching refers to dependent origination, the process of the interdependent arising of things. As outlined earlier, there are two formats of courses of dependent origination in reference to the suffering of human beings. The first format illustrates the arising of suffering. The second format illustrates the cessation of suffering. The middle teaching describes these two processes. 1. Origination Samudaya. The origination cycle of dependent origination. Avidya to Sankara, to Vijnana, to Jati, to Jara Marana, to Soka Parideva, Dukkha Domanasa Upayasa equals the origin of suffering. 2. Cessation Nirodha. The cessation cycle of dependent origination, ignorance ceases to volitional formations cease, consciousness ceases to birth ceases to aging and death cease, to sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief and despair cease equals the cessation of suffering. Suffering is of primary concern to human beings. The origination cycle is presented to identify the source of suffering, and the first step is to outline the factors acting as a foundation for suffering. As for the cessation cycle, the term Nirodha in the middle teaching has a broad range of meaning. Besides referring to the process leading to the cessation of suffering, it also refers to nibbana, freedom from suffering. The middle teaching incorporates both the cessation cycle and nibbana. By describing the teachings on suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation cycle, and the freedom from suffering, one may conclude that the entire essence of Buddhadhamma has been captured. But this is not the case. The reason for this is that the middle teaching purely describes naturally occurring phenomena. It does not include the means of spiritual practice applied by human beings. The cessation cycle has found in the middle teaching as depicted as a pure, i.e. theoretical or mechanical process of nature. It describes the necessary interrelated causes and conditions that lead to the end of suffering, but it does not explain the details of practical application. It does not specify what needs to be done in practical terms to reach this end. People may study the middle teaching and gain a gradual understanding of the cessation cycle and the principle of ending suffering, but they still require practical advice to achieve results conforming to this principle. Our responsibility in regard to nature is to gain knowledge, initially an intellectual grasp of natural truths, and then to apply this knowledge to spiritual practice. This is the link between objective natural processes and Dhamma practice. The Pali term for Dhamma practice, including methods of practice, is Paticcasamuppada. This term specifically refers to rules of practice, methods of practice, or ways of conducting one's life in order to reach the end of suffering. The Buddha set down this practice in conformity with the middle teaching on the cessation of suffering, and he called this practice the middle way of practice, Majjhima Patipada, or simply the middle way. It is a balanced practice according with the laws of nature, and it gives results according to the natural cycle of cessation. It is impartial. It does not swing to either of the two extremes that cause entanglement or deviation from the correct path. The middle way can be simply referred to as the path. The path is comprised of 8 factors, and because it leads to awakening, i.e. the state of a noble person, it is called the Noble Eightfold Path, Arya Atangika Magga. The Buddha said that this is an ancient path, which has been traversed by the perfectly enlightened ones of the past. The Buddha rediscovered this path and revealed it to others, showing the way to those who are ready to be trained. This path of practice produces results in accord with the cessation cycle. It enables causes and conditions to proceed in an interconnected way until the natural process reaches its end. The achievement of the path marks the transition from the theoretical cycle of cessation, or from a preliminary knowledge of the truth, to practical application. The transition from the theoretical cycle of cessation to practical application can be illustrated in this way. Cessation Nirodha, cessation of ignorance to cessation of volitional formations, to cessation of consciousness, to cessation of birth, to cessation of aging and death, sorrow, despair equals cessation of suffering. Path, Magga, right view, Samaditi, plus right intention, Sama Sankappa, plus right speech, Sama Vacha, plus right action, sama kamanta, plus right livelihood, sama ajiva, plus right effort, sama vayama, plus right mindfulness, sama sati, plus right concentration, sama samadhi, to cessation of suffering. Here are some significant points concerning the connection between the cessation cycle and the practice of the path. The cessation cycle is a process occurring in nature. The path is a way of practice for human beings to achieve results in accord with this natural process. The path arises from applying knowledge of the cessation cycle. This knowledge is developed into a method of practice, and one who follows this practice must have at least a rudimentary understanding of the cessation cycle. For this reason, the path begins with right view. The cessation cycle deals directly with the relationship between causes and conditions. It is described as the cessation of causes and conditions that give rise to suffering. Cessation in this context is decisive and complete. It is an end to and freedom from all problems. The path of practice, on the other hand, is flexible. The details of practice can be described in terms of different degrees of difficulty, and the 8 factors of the path can be expanded upon into various levels of complexity. The path to liberation is gradual, and the reduction or elimination of problems is commensurate with the extent or degree of a person's practice. The cessation cycle focuses explicitly on causes and conditions. It is impersonal, and it points to the utter elimination of such causes and conditions. It includes little mention of good and bad or good and evil. The path is gradual. It constitutes an increase in the power of goodness to combat and vanquish negative, obstructive forces. It emphasizes the abandonment of the bad and the cultivation of the good at many levels. The cessation cycle is theoretical, the path is practical and methodical. To use an analogy, the cessation cycle is like the set of principles involved in extinguishing a fire. Fuel must be removed, the oxygen supply cut off, and the temperature reduced. The path is similar to the methods used to achieve results based on these principles. What is needed to remove the fuel, cut off oxygen, and reduce temperature? This requires much effort, both in acquiring the necessary equipment and planning tactics. Should water or an alternative fire retardant be used? What tools are needed? How should one respond in the case of ordinary fires? Electrical fires, oil fires, and gas fires. How does one access the fire to and protect oneself? And how does one train people to act as firefighters? Similarly, the cessation cycle is like a set of principles involved in treating disease, which refers directly to the removal of pathological elements, the elimination of germs, the removal of toxins and foreign substances, the repair of faulty or weakened tissues and organs, the supply of deficient nutrients, and the improvement of one's mental condition. The path is like the treatment of disease, which may only involve a brief review of medical principles, and yet comprise elaborate and complex procedures, including examination, diagnosis, medication, surgery, nursing, physiotherapy, the manufacture and use of medical equipment, the creation of clinics and hospitals, health administration, and the training of medical staff. The 8 fundamental factors of the path can be expanded on and rearranged into many formats, groups and stages to correspond with various objectives, persons, circumstances, conditions and levels of readiness, all of which requires detailed study. The middle way is therefore explained in a separate section of Buddhadhamma. This explanation can be divided into 2 parts. First is a description of the 8 factors, which is a basic preliminary structure, and second is an expansion and rearrangement of these factors into new outlines according to specific circumstances.